Welcome everybody. Welcome to the parallel session on health and climate change. I'm Alistair Woodward. I'm from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm going to be chair for the next hour and a half. This is a topic that's received a good deal of attention in the last 12 months, as well as the fifth assessment report from the IPCC. There have been a number of other substantial documents that have reported on health and climate change. The US Third National Climate Assessment, for example, the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change, which we're going to hear a bit more about today, and a number of other interesting and useful sources. I'd mention, for example, the collection edited by Colin Butler called Climate Change and Global Health, which was published late last year. There are some common threads running through these reports. Let me summarize briefly what I think are some of the most significant. Firstly, impacts are evident already. Extreme events we heard about this morning, such as heat waves and fires, have been attributed with high probability to climate change, and the death toll from these events runs into the tens of thousands. The influence of climate on food and water security threatens the fundamental basis of good health, of course. These pressures will become acute for hundreds of millions of people in the second half of this century. Of all the mechanisms by which climate change influences health, it's the indirect effects of civil disorder, forced population movement, economic perturbations that are likely to be the most serious. Another point that we come back to frequently in the documents I've referred to is the fact that climate change is a risk multiplier. I'm sure you will have all heard that expression. But what it means is that the health penalties of climate change apply principally to populations in low-income countries and to socially disadvantaged groups everywhere. The most effective way of reducing vulnerability to climate change from a health point of view, in the short term anyway, is the provision of basic public health services where these are presently absent or ineffective. And there's a silver lining to an otherwise dark cloud, because climate change provides opportunities as well as challenges. Said so frequently, it become a bit of a stereotype perhaps. But it's true that many low-carbon policies are potentially health-enhancing, and it's important to bear that in mind. But the recent reports also make it clear that we face some tough issues and some big questions. This conference is a unique opportunity to pool ideas and share suggestions for the way forward. So I'd like to outline here what I think are some of the most difficult aspects of climate change and health. First, is mitigation of climate change compatible with health equity? Because, historically it was the booming use of fossil fuels that powered improvements in health in what is now the rich world. And the big question is, can low-income countries follow the same health trajectory under a radically different energy regime? What needs to happen in order for that to occur? Are there risks? Poorly chosen emission policies may block health gains amongst those who are least advantaged and therefore possibly increase global inequalities. Let me give you an example. Came up in the IPCC report. The use of biomass fuels in poor households. It's argued by some that ending fossil fuel subsidies, at least in a totalitarian fashion, may block the move to the most feasible low-polluting fuel, which is LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, and thereby entrench health disadvantage. How fast will adaptation track global warming? There are plenty of examples in the past of human initiative taming harsh environments. Indigenous cultures provide many lessons, for example. There's recent evidence that well-organized emergency responses can neutralize or at least blunt the health impacts of extreme heat and floods. I suggest there are two issues here. One is the rate of change, mentioned in one of the talks earlier this morning. We need to know what must be done to keep health protection ahead of the wave of climate changes. But there is a second, more challenging and fundamentally more important issue, and one of our speakers will be talking to this, and that is the question of whether there are thresholds, levels beyond which adaptation as we know it simply cannot control the damage caused by climate change. Then, how far will interventions with co-benefits take us towards our climate targets? Co-benefits are popular. I like them because they offer the prospect of climate gain with minimal pain. There are plenty of examples in the health field, as I've already mentioned, where health-improving policies coincide with energy efficiency and sustainability. But is there a danger that we're influenced too much by the convenience of these alignments? The hard question, I believe, is just how much can be achieved with these win-win policies. Brought home to me by work we did in New Zealand looking at what would be the consequences of moving 5% of short urban car trips from motor vehicles to bicycles. And the answer is that you achieve a good deal in health terms, maybe 100 deaths a year saved as a result of getting people more active, and about 22 million litres of fuel each year in a population of 5 million. That sounds good, but it amounts to less than 1% of transport-related emissions. Bicycles are great, but may not be enough on their own. Deep-rooted, widespread, and potentially disruptive changes are going to be needed, I suspect, to make the deep reductions in emissions that are necessary. My last big question, difficult issue, why is climate change so seldom described as a health issue? I'm biased. Many of you may share this bias. It's hard to think of something that's more important as an outcome of climate change than a life cut short or unnecessary suffering from disease and injury. Yet, health is not prominent in the public discussions of climate change. There was a very interesting review of the way that AR5 was reported in the media in the US and the UK, published recently in Nature Climate Change. What they found was that climate change was almost never presented as a health issue. The dominant framings were disaster, security, political struggle, and the presence or absence of scientific controversy. Why is health invisible? Is it something to do with the way that we, as supposed experts, communicate what we say or how we say it? Well, I'm confident that our speakers are going to have a good deal to say about these and other important topics. We've got 3 presentations that deal with risks of climate change, how to turn these risks into opportunities, and the implications for health policy and health services. I'm hoping that there will also be time before we close for questions and discussion. But to begin, let me introduce our first speaker, Sir David King. Sir David is the UK Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change. He served as the UK Government Chief Scientific Advisor under Prime Ministers Blair and Brown. He was formerly Head of Chemistry at Cambridge University, and he's written an enormous number, over 500 I believe, academic papers and received numerous honours. Over the last year, he's been leading a very interesting international project, putting together a climate change risk assessment suitable for heads of government. And he's going to speak on that topic this afternoon. So David.
Good afternoon, and Alistair, thank you very much for that introduction and also for hosting this important session. I think we are going to hopefully make some progress on this critically important issue. So what I'm going to do is share some thoughts that arise from the risks of climate change and that emerge from this report that is about to be published. As Alistair said, these include serious risks to human health as well as to many other things that matter to us. Now, as you've heard, I work for the UK government, and I'm going to start by giving you some of my experiences as Chief Scientific Advisor in the more general field. Of course, a big part of my work was involved in alerting our government and other governments to the risks associated with climate change. But my job right now is to help us secure an effective global deal in this city in 5 months' time to reduce emissions and keep alive our chances of limiting climate change to a manageable level. And when I say keep alive our chances, those words are carefully chosen. As government leaders prepare to instruct their negotiators, one question is more important than any other, and that is, how much priority should they place on countering climate change? How much effort should they expend? In other words, how much should they care about it? Now, while the answer to this question depends on many factors, it ought at least to be informed by a full assessment of risk. And put simply, this means that government leaders should know, if we do not manage to reduce global emissions, what is the worst that could happen? Now, in the Foreign Office in Britain, much of our work is driven by a consideration of worst-case scenarios. We don't dismiss worst-case scenarios, far from it. And we also, of course, look at the need to avoid them. That's why we invest so much in nuclear non-proliferation, counter-terrorism, and conflict prevention. In many cases, the overriding objective is to avoid an outcome which may be highly unlikely, but which is potentially catastrophic. And that's how I want to frame the issue of climate risk. In matters of public health, it is often the same. So when I was UK Government Chief Scientific Advisor, our country found itself, as did other countries, facing the risk of an outbreak of the H5N1 avian flu. Now, in assessing this risk, the team I set up started not by asking what was most likely to happen, but by asking what was the worst thing that could happen. And the worst that could happen was that the virus could become transmissible between humans. And we assessed that the direct impact of this to the people of Britain could be up to 1 million fatalities in a relatively short space of time. 3 to 6 months. Now, to understand the full extent of the risk, we also developed scenarios to assess the indirect systemic impacts. And we found that fear of the virus would lead to the closure of supermarkets, public transport systems, schools, and businesses. Not by direct action of government, but simply by individuals acting. Emergency response systems would collapse and society would be brought to a halt. So this is an extreme outcome. We assessed, therefore, the likelihood of the virus switching to becoming transmissible between humans, and we assessed that likelihood as low. Over a 20-year period, the chances were assessed to be less than 1%. But even this estimated possibility was itself highly uncertain. So when we put a percentage at that low level, well, there's a fair bit of good guesswork involved. If we'd asked what was the most likely outcome, the answer would have been nothing significant. But by asking what was the worst that could happen, and by seeking to understand this as fully as possible, we provided the government with a clear picture of the risk. But as ever, when you provide a government with a clear picture of risk, you need to say, and this is what you should do. And so the government then decided that this level of risk was unacceptable, and so it devoted considerable resources to vaccinating the public an effort that still continues today. Now, moving on to climate change. In assessing and communicating the risks of climate change, we need to take the same approach. And I'm stressing that because actually we haven't been doing that. While there are many risk assessments that consider the worst case in terms of extreme weather events, there seems to be much less deliberate consideration of worst case scenarios when it comes to long-term climatic impacts and changes. For example, Working Group 2, Contribution to the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, says that most studies of the impacts of climate change on human health consider modest increases in global temperature, typically less than 2 degrees centigrade. The same report finds that, and I quote, relatively few studies have considered impacts on cropping systems for scenarios where global mean temperatures increase 4 degrees centigrade or more. And similar statements can be found in the chapters on ecosystems, poverty, human security, and on economic impacts. In summary, it seems that most of the scientific research in these areas is considering not the worst case scenario or scenarios, but the best case scenarios. Another way of thinking about this is to consider how information is presented with graphs. One of the prime ministers I've served never wanted more than one graph in a 30-minute session. Quite important that you choose your graphs carefully. And across all of the chapters of the Working Group 2 report on impacts of climate change, almost all of the graphs are in the form of projected severity of impact as a function of time. And these graphs show the most likely impact as a function of time. They don't necessarily show the worst case, since this could be at a lower likelihood or at a later time. They're looking at the most likely for a given temperature rise. Now, conversely, a risk assessment asks first, what is the worst that could happen? What event, what outcome would have the greatest impact? Or what is it that we want to avoid? And then, how likely is that? So where risks change over time, an appropriate format for a graph is to first identify what it is we want to avoid, and then to plot its likelihood as a function of time. Of course, I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean. Now, this is the approach we've taken in this new climate change risk assessment, a report that will be released on Monday, 13th of July, next Monday. In this assessment, we've not tried to do any new scientific research as such, but we have tried to make a clearer assessment of risk from the science that we already have. I'm particularly grateful to Alistair for contributing one of the strongest chapters to this report, and I'm going to draw on that chapter to give an example. So this first example is about the risk of heat stress to human health. Even in today's climate, heat waves can, of course, be fatal. More than 1,000 people died in Pakistan, that's the number today, just a few weeks ago when temperatures rose to 46 degrees. A country used to high temperatures. The same happened in India a few weeks before that. In Europe, 2003, some 70,000 people died in that heat wave, summer 2003. But in today's climate, it's usually the old or the very young who die of heat stress, or those who have worked too hard while exposed to the sun. Now, in future, the worst that could happen would be levels of heat and humidity that exceed the human body's limits, upper limits of tolerance. That is to say, climatic conditions would be fatal even for healthy people who are lying down in the shade, but outside. Such conditions could cause fatalities on a huge scale. The lives of everyone without access to reliable air conditioning would be at risk. And of course, electricity supply could easily be overloaded under these conditions, and a power cut would be even more deadly. Now, this is clearly a situation we would wish to avoid. So we've investigated its likelihood, and the next slide shows this. This is the likelihood of the temperature of more than 40 degrees centigrade over a 3-day period, which is considered to be serious for human survival. So we see from this graph the probability of an individual experiencing a heat wave that would threaten the life of anyone without air conditioning in a given year. It shows how that probability increases depending on global average temperature increase for people in 3 regions of the world: northern India, southeastern United States of America, and southeastern China. And as you can see, in today's climate, the probability is very close to 0. On a linear scale, it looks like it's 0. But after the global temperature rises by about, the global average temperature rises by about 4 degrees, the probability begins to take off. It rises very quickly. At a temperature rise of 6 degrees, the probability is about 50%, meaning that half of the people in those regions could be affected in any given year. Now, as I stressed before, there's nothing new about the science in this study. It's the way the science has been presented that is new. And it should be clear to any political leader that if a global temperature rise of a few degrees, the chances of something terrible happening become significant. I'll give you a second example. We all know that climate change will affect crop production, but our crop models give such a wide range of estimates that a political leader presented with this wide range would have no real way of knowing what the impact will be. So instead of trying to make a prediction, a much simpler way is to focus on what we want to avoid. What we want is to avoid crop failure. And just like people, crops have threshold temperatures which, if exceeded, can kill them, or in this case, prevent them yielding grain. We ask how likely it is that those thresholds are crossed. And this graph shows the probability of exceeding a threshold temperature during the flowering season that would result in severe crop failure for 3 varieties of rice in Jiangsu province in China. And as you can see, with a global temperature increase of around 4 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, the probability of crop failure in a given year is around 25% for 2 varieties of rice and around 75% for the other. And this makes the risk very clear. At high degrees of temperature increase, crop failure could be much more frequent for many crops in many parts of the world. And this is only looking at temperature. Let me say why I mention that. At the same time, we have rising sea levels. And one of the great areas for crop growing is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Rising sea levels make that unprotectable from saline water, and that entire paddy field area would be lost. So there's a great risk that the world as a whole will not be able to produce enough food, and this is a second way in which the climate change could pose an existential threat to human health. And in both of these examples, heat stress and crop production, we can see that the risks become extreme with a temperature increase of around 4 degrees. So now we need to ask, how likely is it that we will reach a temperature rise global average of around 4 degrees centigrade? The risks of 4 degrees are so great that the UK's Climate Change Committee of experts has recommended that we should aim to keep the probability of exceeding 4 degrees global average rise to below 1 in 100. And that is quite a large demand. So the next slide shows the probability of exceeding 4 degrees, how it changes over time for the 4 emissions pathways used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We you can see that on the highest emission pathway, the red one, we could exceed 4 degrees rise as early as 2060. We're pretty close to still being on that pathway, by the way, if we're very unlucky, but we're almost certain to exceed it eventually. See, if we go up to 2100, it's approaching 90-95% probability. We see on the middle, that's the orange pathway, the probability of exceeding 4 degrees is about 1 in 3 by the end of the century, rising to 1 in 2 by 2150. So even on the medium, light blue pathway, the risks are significant. A nearly 1 in 10 chance of exceeding 4 degrees by the end of the century, rising to 1 in 5 by 2150. The dark blue graph is the optimal pathway, and you can see that that is the only pathway that keeps the probability reasonably low, not zero. So it should be clear to any political leader that we can only be sure of avoiding a 4-degree temperature rise with all of these catastrophic consequences, some of which I've mentioned, if we follow the very low dark blue pathway. There is no choice in terms of future actions if we wish to have some surety about avoiding these dreadful outcomes. Now, I'm not going to show any more examples because I don't want to use up all of our time. I'm looking forward to a good discussion. But I would like to conclude by suggesting that we in the science community need to think very carefully about what we choose to research and how we go about presenting the outcomes of that research in a way that is relatively easily understood by political decision makers. I think most of us here share a concern about how climate change could affect the future health of our countries, our communities, and our families. And if we want government leaders to act on our knowledge, then we need to tell them what is the worst that could happen if they do not act. And we're using, let me stress, the same procedures that we use in other risk analyses. That's why I started with a broader view of risk analysis. We need to ask them what they would most wish to avoid and then show them how likely that could become. And if we do that, I believe we may, hopefully, be pleasantly surprised by the outcome. A full assessment of risk will never be a sufficient condition for responding effectively to climate change, but it is a necessary condition. So if we can in any way improve our risk assessments, then that is an opportunity we should take. And the final slide shows the title and authors of the report. I want to thank, these are the senior co-authors. I want to thank them, and I want to thank especially the project manager, my colleague Simon Sharp. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Our next speaker is Nick Watts. Nick studied medicine and economics at the University of Western Australia. He was, for a number of years, director of the Global Health and Climate Alliance, and most recently he's been head of project for the 2015 Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health, which was released only a couple of weeks ago. And it's on that report, on that the work of the Commission, that Nick is going to talk to us.
All right, so my name is Nick Watts, and hopefully if you've managed to forgive Alistair's New Zealand accent, you'll forgive my Australian accent, but I apologize in advance. I'm here talking about the 2015 Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change. We're a commission that was published on the 23rd of June, and the report that the commission put together represents around 2.5 years of work that has been under place. For those not in the health profession or that don't know, the Lancet is a medical journal, arguably one of the world's most influential medical journals. It's our equivalent of Nature or Science. And so I thought I would talk briefly through some of the key findings, some of the key messages that the Commission has put forward. Thank you. To start, there it is as proof that it exists, because I don't have any copies with me at the moment. The headline quote there, which is sort of the headline message that the report and the Commission builds towards, is that responding to climate change, tackling climate change, could be the greatest global health opportunity of this century. And we spend some 53 pages trying to demonstrate how that is the case. What I will say, I couldn't agree more, I don't think, with David's point about the need to engage in better communication, the need to present the kinds of data and science that we're putting forward in more effective ways. One thing that the Commission, I think, did well is our launch strategy and the outreach and the communications that are going on. So far, we've been out for about 2 weeks now. There's been 1.8, now 1.9 million downloads of the report. We were trending on Twitter in 13 different countries. I don't know hugely what that means, but I'm told that it's a good thing. At one stage, we were trending above Taylor Swift, but below Batman, which I think is appropriate. And we held launch events in all of these cities around the world, trying to draw on the global information that are presented in the report, and then make it locally relevant for health professionals in each of these cities, and are continuing an outreach program over the next 5 months or so. So to start, 2.5 years ago, we began with the mission, I suppose, of mapping out the impacts of climate change, and these have been done extensively by experts for a number of years, so that part was relatively easy. And then talking about the necessary policy responses in order to ensure the highest attainable standard of health. And that was the different part. We were looking at, in many cases, a number of the policy responses proposed by expert bodies like the IPCC, and reinterpreting them and reconsidering them in terms of their health implications at a macro level. So the Commission split its work into those chapters. We began by reviewing the climate science and the impacts, and that was really the easy part, I suppose, and then went on to present the policy options around 4 key areas: around community resilience and adaptation, with a focus on, obviously, public health; energy and technical solutions; economic policy and financing mechanisms; and political mechanisms. And a number of commissioners, a number of authors are in the room today. We heard from one of them earlier on in the plenary. Michael Grubb took a lead on the sort of the energy and economic policy side of things. So it was really quite a broad range of people involved. What I should say is that this is not the first sort of commission of its kind. In 2009, there was a report by the Lancet, which ran with it was a report by the Lancet which looked at assessing the impacts of health on climate change. And I think importantly, as health professionals, we obviously agree that there's a need to do this. There's a need to understand those health impacts. But something that we're used to in public health is going that extra step further. We almost started from the perspective that if you were a doctor looking to reanalyze the impacts of tobacco on the alveoli of the lung and look at the relationships between heart disease and lung disease and all the other things that it causes, it would be irresponsible for us to simply only look at those, only reanalyze that biomedical interaction. What the Commission wanted to do was take the public health approach, which is to look at the different policy responses that health professionals can engage with to respond. And so that was our starting point. Thanks. We brought together 47 commissioners and all up around 150 people working. And I think what was special about this commission was that we had climate scientists, we had geographers, social scientists, economists, political scientists, and the whole way through integrated, working with public health professionals to really try and make sure that the way that a public health professional thinks about and responds to these sorts of problems was integrated into the report. And it goes a long way to sort of speaking to the kinds of risk analysis that David was talking about. From a clinical or from a medical perspective, if a young child comes in with a certain kind of rash and with a stiff neck and a fever, the immediate thing that any good doctor will do is start to prescribe IV antibiotics and then take some tests. What they won't do is hold endless case conferences for 2 days, do all the tests they can, and then come back and start to act. Because they would be treating for potentially bacterial meningitis, and the cost of inaction, the cost of waiting until there was absolute certainty would be simply too great. So this is our collaboration again, a large number of groups, and as I sort of mentioned, I think support and input from a whole range of others. The World Health Organization, from DMID in particular, gave fantastic input, I think, the whole way through, and a whole range of other institutions, as well as the 11, as well as the 11 there. Okay, so having introduced the commission, these are, I suppose, our key findings. The first is really starting off where the 2009 commission left off. It's that the health impacts are potentially catastrophic for human survival and for human health. And we ran through and looked at a number of these different, almost worst-case scenarios that you can imagine, that they threaten to undermine the last half-century of gains in development and global health, and that this threat is perceived not just in low and middle-income countries, but all the way up to high-income countries as well. The potential to undermine that progress is found the whole way through. And then I suppose the last point, which is almost a clinical judgment, is that this is a medical emergency. And this was something that the health professionals and the public health professionals on board that were used to engaging and considering some of these health questions really wanted to stress. This was something that they could not be more clear about how concerned they were. Thanks. And so to help communicate that, although perhaps not very effectively, we made this. Very nice colors, yeah. We made this. This is one of many diagrams in the commission. Hopefully some of them are more simpler or more helpful in communicating, but this one runs through the health impacts of climate change and looks at how they sort of directly interact with the end stage there. What the commission stresses when talking about this diagram is the concern with those multi-hit scenarios, the concern that happens when risks become, when risks sort of cease to become imperfectly correlated and start to trend towards sort of more perfect correlation. Physiological systems, human systems, do a very good job of adapting to one insult. But when a human body gets hit again and again, when the heart gets hit as well as the lungs, as well as the kidney, and in the same way when a community gets hit a number of times a year, that's when you start to lose adaptive capacity, and when what is otherwise sort of, you know, a health concern becomes fatal or becomes a human catastrophe. And the commission talks a lot about this. What we do is we take a number of figures. So first one, yeah. We take a number of direct health impacts. So here we have the change in heat wave frequency from 1995 to 2090. Next one. Thanks. But look importantly at how that will change in terms of where populations are. From a health professional's perspective, we care most about heat wave when it influences directly the health of an individual. So the first graph, obviously the heat wave frequency. The second graph looks at changes in exposure, but changes in exposure using 2010 populations. So we go to the next one. Using SSP2, we then augment that and overlay the climactic with the demographic changes, and find that populations are migrating, they're aging, and they're growing into areas of greater climactic exposure. And this has led to previously an underestimation of the impacts in the last one. And one more. And these are the two. And this is one of the, on the impact side, this is one of the central findings for the Commission. It's always very nice. We were doing this on not a huge budget. It's always very nice when halfway through your study, someone else who has a much larger budget comes out and does a similar methodology and confirms your results. And that happened to us. And so these are sort of figures and changes in exposure that I think we feel quite comfortable with. Next one. And so the Commission runs through and does this for heat wave, it does this for drought, and it does this for extreme rainfall. And these are exposure events. So predicts an additional 3 billion exposure events for elderly people, here defined as over the age of 65, who experience heat wave by the end of the century, and an additional 1.4 billion drought exposure events. That's not for the elderly, I think that's for the whole of population. And in the appendix is able to break that down into the various different ways that SSP can be broken down, and looks at this in a demographic sense as well, which matters hugely, particularly for drought. Thanks. But importantly, this was only one fifth of the Commission. The next 4 chapters go on to describe the response, go on to describe the way in which, as we write here, responding to climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity of the 21st century. And these benefits are realized in part by avoiding the loss of development from climate change, in part from the health co-benefits that accrue from the different actions, and in part from actions to grow a sustainable economy. What the Commission does is, particularly for adaptation and mitigation policies, talks about no-regret scenarios, talks about things that would be, from a public health perspective, good to do regardless of where we end up on climate change, and even cost-effective to do regardless of where we end up on climate change. And the Commission lays a number of these things out, a lot of them around health system strengthening, around training up and strengthening health workforce, disease surveillance, improved research. This isn't the first time I've realized that our diagrams are too complicated. This is another one. Hopefully this is more useful because it's available online. What it does is it runs through a whole range of different policies you might want to put in place to mitigate climate change. And then, as you see with the lines, corresponds them with different possible health impacts or health benefits. Online, in the next 2 or 3 days, it's not up yet, but in the next 2 or 3 days, you'll be able to go through and mouse over one of those lines and see the studies that demonstrate that effect and see the potential size of that effect. At the moment, the lines there don't show the size of the effect. But we hope that this is useful as well in demonstrating that there are some very serious bundles of co-benefits that run when you put together a whole suite of policies. And I think this was something that was included by our energy experts. What they wanted to communicate was, from their perspective, what they were trying to do, this is the 3rd chapter, what the 3rd chapter of the Commission's report was trying to do was look at the global burden of disease of the current energy mix, of the current global energy mix, and then look at the different projections and look at different possible scenarios out of that. And so this I suppose is illustrative. The data behind this diagram you can find online. But it looks at the health impacts in terms of direct emissions and direct effects, and in terms of climate change of, for example, the 3, you can't quite see, but the red, the blue, and the yellow, which is oil, coal, and gas, the different global energy mix. Thanks. Okay. So, as well as compiling these different possible options, as well as re-understanding climate change as partly a threat and then as potentially an opportunity, what the Commission wanted to do was provide recommendations for how governments could start to move from a threat to an opportunity. And so one of the key ones there, and the first one I've put there, is discussing the need for a rapid phase out of coal-fired power plants to protect cardiovascular and respiratory health. The Commission maps out some 2,200 and something coal-fired power plants that are currently in the development pipeline. These are either in pre-construction or currently being constructed or under approval, and looks at the potential exposure to health of each of these pipelines, and comes to the conclusion that there would be net benefits for health if most of these in the very near future were phased out. The Commission talks about encouraging a transition to cities that support and promote healthy lifestyles. And I think as our very first recommendation, which I've moved to number 3, it talks about the need to invest in more research, monitoring, and surveillance for health and climate change. I've moved that to number 3 because I was told that was a bad thing to put up as sort of the first thing. It's never a good idea to ask for more money as your sort of first recommendation as a researcher, apparently. Okay. Thanks. The third central message from the Commission, and this comes primarily from people like Michael Grubb, who we saw earlier on from our energy experts and other economists, is that achieving a decarbonized global economy and securing, and importantly, securing the public health benefits it offers, is no longer primarily a technical or an economic or a technological question. It's now entirely a political one. And the purpose of this statement really is to I think, draw out, for the health profession in particular, who very sort of commonly get, as you can understand, get overwhelmed by the amount of information that's thrown at them, that there are, yes, economic challenges, that there are, yes, technological challenges, but for the most part, the economists, the technologists, the engineers, the energy experts believe that these challenges are able to be overcome. The thing that is stopping them at the moment is a political problem, and this is important for public health professionals to understand. And so we go on, and there are a total of 10 policy recommendations. Some of them I think are fairly straightforward. The need for sort of a carbon price, or as some of our economists put it, sort of a coalition of of countries that can come together under a framework for a carbon price. We talk about the need for better capacity, support, and legislation around the quantification of the health benefits of mitigation. It's not always necessarily the problem that there isn't very good legislation. In India, for example, there is fantastic legislation protecting local populations from the damages of unhealthy energy choices. The problem is that there isn't local capacity to enact that and to do the studies that are needed in order to combat unhealthy energy decisions. Thanks. Okay, we can go one more. So I'll wrap up by saying that the final conclusion of the Commission is that given that that climate change presents potentially the greatest global health threat of the 21st century, but that responding to climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity of this century, and that the thing that is stopping us from getting there is primarily a political problem, the Commission came together and is launching, or has launched, its new countdown to 2030. And this is a commitment from the Lancet and a number of other major medical journals around the world to every year track progress on moving from climate change as a threat to climate change as an opportunity for public health, and report on this progress, tracking what we have now, 17 major indicators, and releasing this report really is sort of an assessment of how public health professionals think they're doing themselves and how governments are doing in responding to climate change. Thank you. So that is a summary of the key findings, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Nick. We're tracking well. There should be good time for questions. The third and final speaker is Dr. Maria Neira, who's Director of the Public Health, Environmental and Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization. She's responsible for WHO's global program on health and environment, which includes not only climate change, but also related fields such as air pollution and water and sanitation. She has a wealth of experience in public health, having previously been Director of Communicable Diseases at WHO. She held a senior ministerial position in the Spanish government, and she previously worked for Médecins Sans Frontières in Africa and Latin America. Maria.
Bonjour. Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. Il y a des francophones dans la salle? Only few, wow. Bonjour les francophones. Let's go back to English. You thought you have been penalized enough by having somebody from New Zealand and then an Australian. It's not the worst, it can be worse. Now you will be having English from a non-native Anglo-Saxon, so you are lucky this afternoon. You will be missing the Australian accent or even the New Zealand at the end of my presentation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a great opportunity to mobilize people like you. I don't know how many medical or public health professionals do we have in the room. What? Okay, that's great, because I thought I was preaching to the converted, and in that sense I was a little bit anxious about that, but in fact we are preaching to the non-converted probably, because you are not from the public health community. This is very exciting, and then it gives me more even enthusiasm for this presentation. Can I have the next one, please? I think you heard it already. There is not much to insist on that. The previous speakers were extremely eloquent in telling you that climate change is an unacceptable risk to health. And I think if we use more often this argument, we might have an impact on the politicians that we are trying to influence, hopefully, before they come again to Paris in December. Nick was very proud about their difficult graphics. We are trying to compete here. And in fact, I'm not demonstrating you anything new here. For those on public health, you know very well that the health risks from climate change are coming from indirect and environmental conditions. Everything will be collaborating, I will say, to multiply the risk that climate change will create for our health. But the most important, the message that I would like to leave you here is that extreme weather events are killing every year tens of thousands of people. Malaria, which is one of the big killers, what we call the big killers in the World Health Organization, malaria, diarrhea, and undernutrition, the three of them are the major killers at the moment, and all of them are terribly climate sensitive. Very sensitive to climate conditions. So as you can imagine, this will be multiplied. And in addition to that, obviously, all of those conditions will create an increased water and air pollution, which is one of the key public health problems we are confronting now. As you know, air pollution is now responsible for more than 7 million premature deaths every year. Imagine that now we will have a factor that multiplies those conditions and create even more risk. C'est bon? Vous entendez mieux maintenant? Okay, thank you. And the good news here is that those risks from climate change in our health are largely preventable. And this is one of the messages that we need to retain at the end of this session for those who were not very well convinced already. The message is that we have proven cost-effective interventions against almost every climate-sensitive health impact. So in fact, this is not something that we need to be paralyzed by the situation. We need to simply accept that it's a massive risk. We have public health interventions, and those public health interventions make sense. And the investments we can do will be, in any case, very good investments. All of those public health interventions can save lives, and not only that, they will be reducing or contributing to reduce climate vulnerability. And the most important message is that strengthening preventing public health functions, including climate resilience, is the best protection for the future. So if we invest on issues like reinforcing our capacity to do vector-borne control, more occupational health interventions, better services for air quality, reducing air quality, food and waterborne infections, all of that are functions that the public health community needs to do anyway. What we need is to prepare and to invest a little bit more. So the prevention. And in fact, we should add that to our already existing core health system functions. We have all of the functions that are described there. What we need is to provide a better and more systematic approach for our colleagues working at the healthcare facilities and making sure that those interventions will be added. And those are what we call the 12 interventions that are part of this framework that we are creating for building resilience at our healthcare facilities. Those are the ones that needs to be better prepared because they will be seeing more cases of malaria, more cases of dengue, more cases of diarrhea, and there will be under stress, and most of those healthcare facilities are already very much under resources and coping with very difficult situations. But let's move to, after the wonderful presentations this afternoon about the health opportunities. How can we make sure that we will transform all of those risks that have been identified for a long time now? Because it has been for more than 10 years that we have very solid scientific evidence. WHO has been working on climate change and health for, I think, more than 20 years now. So I think the scientific evidence is there. All the great reports that have been produced by many are contributing to that. Our ministers of health have been very much mobilized. A resolution where all the ministers of health sign the World Health Assembly has been approved as well. So now how can we change that and we create some action, and we said that hopefully in Paris in December, the foreign affairs ministers or the prime ministers that will come here will be very much inspired and they will sign a treaty for the COP21, because in fact, the treaty they are signing can be the most powerful public health treaty of this century. And let me tell you why. Can you move the next one, please? In fact, what we were saying is that since we have 5 months between now and December, let me give you 5 ideas of what could be the way to influence those politicians. One, we have an opportunity. We need to quantify and make sure that everybody understands that mitigation, climate change mitigation, can be a public health opportunity. And in fact, the public health opportunity will call mitigation primary prevention. Most of those interventions, buildings, transport, industry, agriculture, electricity, they are all contributing to the generation of the greenhouse gases emissions. And all of them, if you click the next one, you will see all of them are having an impact on our health. Let's take the sample of transport, for instance. Transport is responsible for 1.2 million deaths from road traffic accidents, and more important, we have 3.2 million deaths every year associated or attributable to the fact that people live in cities where they have a very sedentary lifestyle. They cannot move, they have to use a transport, they cannot use a bicycle, they cannot walk, and therefore this sedentary lifestyle is contributing as well to cause morbidity and mortality. Another very critical example is that, as I mentioned before, we have more than 7 million deaths now every year caused by air pollution, and this pollution is generated partly because of the use of electricity and heat, and therefore, if we take action to reduce that contribution to the greenhouse emissions, in fact, what we are doing is to contribute to reduce those 7 million deaths caused every year by the generation of this electricity and energy. Thank you. Next one. So what we need to make sure is that we need to avoid those circles to increase and increase at the level that the green one, if you click the next one, will be so big that we cannot control it. Next one, please. There is another opportunity to mitigate and quantify how doing mitigation policies in fact contributing to public health. You see that a big percentage of the population in the world, more than 3 billion people today, are still using for cooking, heating, and lighting in their household. They are using fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are contributing to this air pollution that are killing at the household level 4.3 million every year. So in fact, if we implement define interventions. Those interventions exist already. They prove to be very effective. Those interventions to address, for instance, the short-lived climate pollutants, we are not only reducing the contribution of those short-lived climate pollutants to the global warming, but in addition to that, we are decreasing the number of deaths caused by exposure to those pollutants, which is very important. Plenty of opportunities. There is as well an economic opportunity there. I know that the International Monetary Fund is not very popular these days, particularly among the Greeks. Are there any Greek in the room? Good for you guys. I know that IMF is not very popular these days, but according to a report of IMF, 5.3 trillion dollars, I don't know what that means, but it's an enormous figure. In global energy subsidies in 2015, they represent unpaid health bill from air pollution. We could be equivalent to that. So in fact, we are investing in the wrong things. And taxing carbon in line with our health impacts will contribute to reduce by approximately 30% air pollution deaths, and therefore 20% CO2 emissions, and contribute to generate and to increase by 3% the GDP in tax revenues. So this economic argument is definitely a very important one that has probably not enough been explored. The second idea, remember 5 months, 5 ideas. The second one is that most of those interventions and most of the action we need to motivate will occur at the city level. And we can contribute to support that local governance for health. Mayors of the cities will have an enormous role to play on the sustainable development. Why mayors? Because they have the capacity to do intersectorial work. They can take a decision of deciding what is the sustainable transport they choose for their cities. The mayor of Paris has been taking very successful measures on promoting cycling and walking in Paris and making a lot of changes of that. The type of transport is the public transport system in Paris has as well been very much promoted, and as well the type of cars that you will be using, whether there are diesel cars or others. So WHO is part of this sustainable development and trying to convince that the cities can play a very important role on this, and more importantly, sustainable urban transport will be a major contribution to public health, while at the same time it contributes to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. Thank you. The third opportunity or idea or initiative will be that the health sector, and when I say the health sector, it's not just the medical sector, it's the big public health community. We need to lead by example. People used to say that doctors, they have a lot of influence, they have credibility, they can make sure that they mobilize others, and their voice is very strong. Therefore, we need to make sure that that community is properly motivated and leading by example. Means that all doctors and public health-related community, we need to give the example that we will try to reduce the energy use at our healthcare facilities. We'll try to use the resources on a more cost-efficient way. We'll try to walk or use a bicycle and not and promote public transport, recycle. There are plenty of examples that we need to give in order to reduce the carbon footprint of our hospitals, which in many countries is an important one and contributes to the CO2 emissions. It's true as well that there are many countries around the world, there are many healthcare facilities, in some continents, like in Africa, around 48% in the sub-Saharan continent, where the healthcare facilities, they don't have a sustainable access to, access to a sustainable source of clean energy. Therefore, for them, it's not a question of reducing the use of energy, it's at the contrary, to help them to reach that level where they have access to clean energy. The fourth idea will be that somehow we need to monitor progress in all of this agenda, and we need to be able to feed back and say, those are the good results that you are generating on the health of the people, and by doing that, stimulating more action. We are convinced that the health can be a very powerful driving force for this climate change agenda, but we need to be able to quantify and monitor those health benefits to keep permanently feeding those policymakers and telling them that they are taking the right decisions. And in this sense, one of the samples is that WHO is investing now at the country level to help them, can I have the next one, on having adaptation plans, and we will be producing the country profiles on climate change and health. If we want to monitor, we need to invest as well. We need to monitor as well how the investments are done. And in fact, if you look at the way on your left, you have the blue circle where you will see that health is very much mentioned when adaptation plans for climate change at country level are proposed. Health is used as a very powerful argument. But on the other circle, you will see that in fact, when it's about investing money, health is receiving only the little blue line that you will see, which is less than 1%, if I'm not wrong, of the funds that are channeled to tackle climate change. And this, we think, is wrong, and this pattern has to change. Now, the idea number 5 is we need to do all of that, but the question is with whom? Of course, we need to convince the policymakers, the governments, the local governance, mayors, citizens, everyone. But if we want to obtain that, why not to mobilize our own troops? Means the public health community, doctors, professionals, nurses, associations, pediatricians. The day that the pediatricians or pneumologists or other medical associations will start to very strongly raise their voice and said, this climate change agenda is not just about environment and polar bears and glaciers melting, it's about humans and it's causing asthma, respiratory, chronic diseases. That day, I think, we will provoke a major change in our society, and hopefully our politicians will be very inspired and they will sign the post-Kyoto Protocol in Paris, and we will be something that we will celebrate all together. Thank you very much for your attention. Should we stay?
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers for two things. One is for giving us very interesting and provoking and informative presentations. And secondly, for keeping to time, because it means that we now have 15 minutes opportunity to receive questions, to engage in discussion, and to follow up any of the points in the discussion, in the presentations that you would like to be clarified. Just in terms of how you might do that, you'll see in front of you that you have microphones. I think almost all of you, except perhaps those sitting right at the back, will have microphones in front of you. To use them, you press the button, the red button. And as important as remembering to turn the button on is remembering to turn the button off when you've finished your question. So, who would like to ask the first question? over here. And could I just ask, when you, could you identify yourself, who you are, where you're from, before you ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, my name is Terry Lawton. I'm from Ireland, and I represent a group called Wexford Skywatch. In 2010, the World Meteorological Organization released a report which listed 42 countries engaged in full-time weather modification activities. I've got a list here of just some of those weather modification programs that took place. This list is just from the US alone. It's very extensive. It would take all day to go through it, but just in the interest of time, I just want to highlight one particular program which took place. It was carried out by Division V Cloud Seeding, and it was precipitation for precipitation purposes. The area covered in this particular program was 184,000 square miles in volume. Now, the IPCC does not list any mention of weather modification in any of its reports. There's no mention at all. It's all just blamed on human activity. So for that reason, I would consider all of those reports to be null and void, first of all. My question is, this would be for David, I suppose. When an extreme climate event occurs, with all of these weather modification programs taking place, how would you determine whether that event was caused by nature or whether it was caused by climate intervention?
Let me take an example, the 2003 hot summer here in Central Europe. I mentioned 70,000 was the number of fatalities, the number of excess deaths attributable to that event. Was that due to climate change? Now, that is an event where we can look at the baseline of temperature and see to what extent an event like that would have given rise to the same temperature, or would it have been less? So if you look at the previous hottest summer in Central Europe, that was 1947. And the deviation from the normal in that hot summer was quite similar to 2003. But because the baseline temperature in 2003 was higher, the climate scientists were able to say with some confidence that the extreme event that caused these fatalities was because of that rising baseline due to climate change. Now that is quite a rare event where you can actually attribute the nature of the challenge to human life to the rising baseline. If I can just stay with you on that. Now extrapolate forward with a medium pathway into the future. By 2050, we would have reached, on average, the temperature in Central Europe equal to that hot summer in 2003. So then when we have an extreme hot summer, it's sitting on this very high baseline. So that's just to explain how climate scientists can approach this. But let me take a more difficult case. Your question is a very good one, and scientists have to be, and climate scientists, very careful about attribution. We had in 2013 the biggest flood in our history in Britain. Well, not quite the biggest. Around 1700 was an equivalent flood. And the UK was severely challenged by that flood. Now, was that due to climate change? Now, the most detailed analysis shows that the incursion of the floodwater from the coastline inland, because there were storms at sea and storms inland, the incursion of the water was further than it would have been without the sea level rise that had occurred. So in that case, we see, even then, that the first signs of attribution to climate change existed. But usually when we get extreme weather events, it's the frequency rather than the extreme nature of the event that is important.
Yes, up here.
Hello, my name is Danny Bicknell, and I work with the Gender Equality Division at UNESCO. So my question is actually related to gender, funny enough, considering that women are half the population and the majority of the population that are most susceptible to climate-related health risks. I'm wondering from a policy level what gender sensitive recommendations or acknowledgements have been made to take that into account in relation to climate change and the policies moving forward. Thank you.
Contribution, and then you can add to that, but totally relevant what you are saying. In the case of air pollution that I was describing before, at the household level, the fact that the women, and they carry the children on their back, they are the ones staying at home and the ones that are cooking or using the fossil fuels at home to heat or to light the house, they are the most vulnerable. And therefore, most of those interventions are very much related, are increasing access to clean fuels at the household level, and for us, this is a major, major priority. Related to mortality is not, I think male are more affected in certain types of diseases, but that will take us to another discussion. But definitely we need to target the vulnerable groups like women at home. And we have a publication in WHO on gender and climate change that you might be interested in having a look at that. Thanks.
No, I mean, I don't think, I think the WHO certainly are leaders in this space in terms of considering, building in a lot of those considerations into the policy and the analysis. From the Commission's perspective, certainly in the appendices, we're able to break down the exposure events by gender. However, these are population level exposure events, so there's not as much of a variance because the variance happens not at an exposure, but at an adaptive sort of capacity or vulnerability sort of level. From that perspective, then I think there are a number of sort of things built in terms of the response specifically from the health system that the Commission talks about, and this really it sort of comes down to the importance of the health system and of the health profession to be able to act as anchors of community resilience, but importantly of equity within the community as well. And this is something that the health profession is particularly adept at managing. It's something we're very used to having to manage sort of health issues on both genders and health issues specific to women as well.
A forest of hands. Sorry, keep your hands up just so I can see. We might start at the beginning here and then move across to the left-hand side. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Moazzam Hussain. I am from Griffith Business School, Griffith University, Australia. Well, I suppose I had the opportunity to go to COP15 in Copenhagen. And we know that that was a very sort of conference with high expectations, but you know the outcome. And now I can see few months' time, COP21 here in this city also built quite a bit of expectation. Why I'm saying this? Because whether we would be able to live with the expectation that we would see in January next year. The premise of this session was mainly climate change is going to contribute to new opportunities to public health. Of course, the studies we have done, particularly two studies, the Commission and also the WHO, was trying to tell us, paint a picture that there is going to be huge opportunities. But I think what I am trying to say was you should communicate these opportunities or what we have in mind, our expectations, few months' time, to those governments or policymakers who are still not convinced. For example, from my own government in Australia, perhaps was not convinced yet. So perhaps also Canada, very high-profile parties. So how we are going to address those? Thank you.
Thank you. That's right. So I think the question is how to communicate opportunities effectively to policymakers. David, could you pick up this to begin with?
Well, I can just tell you what my role is and what I'm doing, and that in a way is an answer to your question. The British government is in a rather different position from the Australian government. We have all-party agreement on climate change. We have a commitment to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. We are reducing emissions on a 4-yearly carbon budget basis. We have already reduced emissions 29%. We will have by 2028 reduced emissions by 52%. We have our own international climate fund with $5.5 billion in it. We have spent it up almost, and next year we will revive that fund. The reason I'm saying all this is Britain has relatively clean hands. And so when I go in to talk to governments, I can say, this is what we're doing. What will you be doing? And I do that with the Australian government, the Canadian governments included. I think the important point is that we decided we have to act by example. By the way, we have nearly 100 climate attachés full-time in our embassies around the world. We see this as the single biggest diplomatic challenge of our era. So I think, however, the answer to your question, if I can take the general point you're making, Copenhagen, yes, was a failure. I wrote 2 op-eds in the weeks running up to Copenhagen saying there could be no agreement. We were all raising expectations far too high. Obama did not have a congressional approval to sign. China said they wouldn't sign. If Obama didn't sign, how could there have been an agreement? We shouldn't have been so optimistic given that background. Today, is this different? Well, today it's got a lot easier for governments to sign up because each country is being asked to sign up to an intended nationally determined contribution. And this means that each country is free to make their own contribution to this reduction process. Now, they're not entirely free, so we're left with the point that you're asking. I've now made 65 official country visits in the last 18 months. We are putting pressure country by country on governments to come up to the plate and actually deliver in time for Paris. But now let me just say, chances of agreement this time round, good. Is the agreement going to keep us within 2 degrees centigrade? Not much chance of that. I wish it was the case. But we are going to have to treat Paris as the starting point for the next part of this process.
Yeah, very quickly, and I agree. We need to make sure, all of us, that Paris is not only a success, but it is perceived as a success. We can't afford another failure. We will not be able to mobilize anything after that. My short answer to you as well is that health can be a very special and new argument to mobilize more action. And why? Even for governments like the ones you described, which are now moving in a different, maybe more conservative way, the answer is, if you don't do it for climate change, do it for the health of the people. And we have the samples of countries like China or India, where now they are moving very strongly because of the air pollution and the mortality related to air pollution. Maybe, I mean, it's not on the climate change agenda, but it's definitely on the health agenda, where they are taking decisions and policy options that somehow will be similar to the climate change adaptation policies. And in fact, if you don't do it for climate change, do it for health. The Clean Air Act was something on the name of the health of the people, not on the name of reducing pollution. So somehow, I think we need to use more that horrible figure of 7 million deaths caused by air pollution, where tackling air pollution will be in big part an opportunity as well to mitigate climate change.
Keeping a close eye on the clock, but I think we have an opportunity for one more question, as long as it is a succinct question. Now, I promised you would have the last say.
Thank you. Alexandra May Hunter from the United States. One of the proposed mitigation techniques for global warming, climate change, is geoengineering. My question is, has the health impacts been looked at by any of your organizations, the health risks, with regard to geoengineering? And if not, do your organizations have any intention of analyzing and assessing health impacts caused by geoengineering? Thank you.
I can say fairly simply, I think, from the Lancet Commission's perspective, it wasn't something that we looked at. We had a brief look to see, at a broad level, what there was known about the health impacts of geoengineering. There wasn't enough that we would be able to summarize, and it wasn't something that we felt we had the capacity to talk about, so we didn't.
There have been several British studies of geoengineering. I can give you my own position on geoengineering. There are two different categories of geoengineering. One is where your actions in a given country impact the whole planet. So, for example, putting material up into the stratosphere so as to reflect sunlight away and cool the planet down. Whichever country puts that rocket up will impact on the whole planet. Now, my view is that we should have a UN moratorium against any such activity, because the outcomes are not under our control. Right? This is a massive experiment that could have very poor effects on the whole of humanity. So I think that that's the first thing. Second thing is the attempts at geoengineering, which effectively amount to sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I'm smiling because in the United States, you've got an EPA which is beginning to have effects on CO2 emission per kilowatt hour from power stations. And if they are coal-fired, they are required to capture carbon dioxide to meet that demand. They're not doing that. They're shutting down the power stations. So even out of the flue from a power station where carbon dioxide concentrations are much higher than in the atmosphere, the cost of doing that, in British terms it's about £100 a tonne, is prohibitive, and so they're shutting them down. I'm afraid the second point I want to make is this is a fig leaf argument. It's a fig leaf argument. The cost of geoengineering is going to be simply prohibitive. We've burnt all that carbon from underground, put it in the atmosphere. We're now looking at pulling it back and putting it back underground. That's going to cost at least as much as mining the coal and burning it. So I think it's a bit of a fig leaf.
Well, thank you to the audience for your questions and participation, and thank you very much to the presenters. Please join me in thanking them for their contribution.